items. Everyone is going to be muted during the presentation, but if you have questions for Joe Comerford, please submit them using the question section of your attendee panel. And if you have any technical difficulties, please contact GoToWebinar directly, and that phone number is 1-800-263-6317. And now I'll turn it over to Susan Scher, WAND's Executive Director, and she will introduce our presenter, Joe Comerford. Susan?
Thank you, Audrey, and hi, everyone. Yes, we have all been on this roller coaster, and some of us feel sicker than others. But Joe Comerford is going to be with us today to give us some answers to all of our questions. And WAND is here to give you the tactics and the ideas for how we can move forward and make things a little bit better from Capitol Hill and spread out across the country. Yes, I'm the Executive Director, and WAND is Women's Action for New Directions. And one of the primary issues that we've worked on for the past 30 years is the Pentagon budget and the entire federal budget and how it can make more sense and spend our dollars more wisely for our peace and security needs. And we have partnered with the National Priorities Project for 20 years because they can really break it down in a way that it not only makes sense, but it's relevant to everyone's daily life in terms of where our tax dollars go and where they can go to maybe be better spent and helpful for all of us for whatever we need, whether it's security or just food on the table. So I really love introducing Joe Comerford because you can read her bio. It will be there on the screen for you. But what I want to say about Joe is that she is one of the best presenters about the federal budget because she knows so much about it, but she can couch it in a way that is clearly understandable and, in fact, exciting. And you may not think that about the federal budget, but Joe makes it so. So welcome, Joe. Really glad to have you back doing this for WAND, and thank you, everyone else, for joining us.
Oh, it's really good to be with you, Susan and Adzi, and all at WAND and Will. I extend the best wishes of NPP's staff and board. It's lovely to have this opportunity to talk with you today, and thanks so much for the invitation. So, riding the fiscal roller coaster, as Susan said, we've been on this roller coaster for some time, and I thought we'd just spend 1 second thinking together. When I say these two words, federal budget, what do we think? When I was speaking yesterday in New York State, and someone said seasickness, another person said frustration, another person said fear. I'm imagining that many of us are holding a multitude of feelings or thoughts when we evoke these two words. At National Priorities Project, we think of the federal budget as the very core of our democracy. And so when it is overtaxed or overwrought or in such chaos, we are concerned for the entire nation. So it's terrific that we are tackling this larger question and larger issue today. So just to get us in the same room, as it will, the virtual room, I just thought we'd start by thinking about what are budgets. So I think of budgets in 4 different ways. I think of our federal budget in how we're going to make the money as a nation. So the President's Blueprint and other budget blueprints will talk about how are we going to generate the revenue? What are the values we hold behind the way we're going to make money? And of course, the corollary to that is how are we going to spend it? What are our national priorities? Where do we think our nation needs our tax dollars? And then there are 2 other things I think about when I think of budgets, assumptions. What do we assume people need? What do we assume the role of government should be in our midst? And of course, ideologies. And right now there are a clash of these 4 things, certainly at the national level and also sometimes in our local communities. And with regard to ideology, the 2 big ones at play right now, and part of the strife that we're seeing is that we have a small government ideology at work in some members of Congress, right? So we have this belief that, and Grover Norquist has said it for us, right, that he doesn't hate government, he just wants to shrink it to the size where he's going to drown it in the bathtub, drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. And this is a belief where, you know, government must be small and we must maximize the private sector to be able to attend to life's details. And then there's another competing set of ideologies that believes in a more robust role for government, some infusion of capital to help achieve some common well-being, and that is the role of government. So when we think about what's happening right now at the federal level, think about the different ways that tensions between all four of these things are currently playing out. And our job today is, of course, to fall a little bit back in love with the federal budget. So my job is to try to demystify what's happening right now. And so in approaching this, we were pretty aware that there would be a range of comfort on the line today. So I'm going to try to do some background catching up for folks who are a little bit new to this conversation and try to go a little bit deeper into current context for those folks who want to think a little bit farther out. And I would just applaud Wand and Will for taking up this issue, because there's absolutely nothing that's more necessary right now than a passionate, informed electorate. And folks on this line are the best hope for our nation, because Congress is broken, the federal budget process is broken, and the people are the ones, we are the ones who can get this back on track. So how did we get here? Let's go back to the most recent milestone or set of milestones, of course, the turn of the year, when we were seeing the end to the Bush-era tax cuts, and we were seeing the onset of something called sequestration. And that was the first fiscal cliff, if you will. We're in fiscal cliff 2, or the revenge of the fiscal cliff as we talk about it here. But in fiscal cliff 1, between, right at New Year's Eve, 2012, we were seeing the end of the Bush tax cuts for all Americans, and Congress was able to find some reconciliation. The work around that was largely having to do with revenue, and we saw in that moment that Congress was allowing the tax breaks for the wealthiest 1% to sunset, and we saw some middle-class tax breaks being put in on shorter time frames if they were not extended permanently. And then we also saw that sequestration was, of course, kicked to March 1st. So that's the last time we were in this kind of confluence of events. Right now we have these four major budget collisions. So the first one is, of course, sequestration, which went into effect March 1st. At the same time that we're dealing with sequestration, we don't have a 13 budget. We have what's called a continuing resolution, which is set to expire March 27th, and I'll talk about that. We also have no 14 budget blueprint from the President. So we'll tackle that a little bit. There are 3 competing proposals that I'll look at a side-by-side quickly on, and MPP is going to release much more on that. And then we're approaching this thing called the debt ceiling. So let's launch in and really start with sequestration first. So sequestration, simply put, is, of course, the employment of automatic, across-the-board spending cuts to achieve deficit reduction. It went into effect as we talked about, March 1st, which happens to be the eve of Dr. Seuss's birthday. So in his honor, the staff of National Priorities Project created this infographic. What sequestration does is it focuses exclusively on the discretionary portion of the budget. It's, in effect, the resurrection of a bad legislative idea from 1985, sort of like bringing back 80s fashion, or worse, 80s hairstyles. It has contemporary roots in the 2011 Budget Control Act, which emerged in August of 2011, the last time we were really having a battle around the debt ceiling. The bottom line is that sequestration was never supposed to happen. It was considered the ultimate penalty for a very badly behaving Congress at that time, and it was supposed to force the super committee to craft a nuanced deficit reduction plan. So you'll remember that the Budget Control Act rolled out in 2 phases. The first phase said, okay, so we can raise the debt ceiling and not default on our obligations, and we're going to take immediately $917 billion out of the budget in terms of deficit reduction measures over 10 years. And then this bipartisan super committee was supposed to achieve $1.2 trillion, more or less, in deficit reduction over the next, again, on top of the $917 billion over a decade. And of course, it failed as a disciplinary measure. And unless it's overturned, it really is on track, sequestration, to fail us all, especially the most marginalized Americans. When I think of charging the super committee to find a bipartisan way to reduce the deficit in 2011 by $1.2 trillion, I think of the definition of insanity. And what we have to do through our work right now is not allow a cycle of this kind of bad governance to continue into 2013 and beyond. So let's take a moment to look at 3 reasons we should really be very concerned about sequestration. The first one is that all discretionary budget cuts are not created equal. So sequestration, of course, again, reduces the deficit by cutting from the discretionary portion. That's the orangey slice as you're looking at the screen on your left. This is, just as its name sounds, the discretionary portion of the overall budget. It's at the discretion of the President and Congress, so it's proposed and debated and voted on every year. It's where citizens have a great deal of opportunity to talk to legislators. And it is, in being 1/3 of the budget pie, it is rather small to achieve this kind of level of deficit reduction. As legislated, it's supposed to slash more or less evenly from what's known as defense and non-defense discretionary spending. And that can sound fair on the surface, but we have to consider that at more than half of all discretionary spending for decades, the Pentagon-related federal expenditures have risen 48% since 2002. So that's a great deal of rise, certainly far above the normal growth of a budget, whereas at the same moment, non-military discretionary spending has increased only 8%, with really notable reductions in funding for key social programs between 2010 and 2013. So sequester cuts to already depleted social initiatives will only mean really 2 things: significant job loss and service cutbacks in sectors where there are already aching gaps between what's needed and what's offered. The other thing to think about is that the widespread need didn't just evaporate on March 1st, the onset of sequestration. The costs of addressing social inequities or social struggles in our local communities will simply begin shifting. And I'm sure that many of you from across the country right now are looking at local papers like I am doing in Western Massachusetts and seeing school budget committees call hearings because there's going to be a gap. So here in this very small area of Western Massachusetts, we're looking at laying off 24 teachers in the coming year because they are, the school committees are really looking at the potential impact of a reduction in Title I and school breakfast and lunch funding and other kinds of disability rights funding that's coming into our local community. And we're talking about property tax hikes, and we're talking about toll roads leading from Connecticut to Massachusetts because this infrastructure money is, again, also going to become more dwindling. So it's something that we should really just continue to stand for and call out as we try to raise our voices for better governance on the part of our Congress. So the second thing to be concerned about is that sequestration would have us forget that budgets are as much about spending as they are about revenue. Right now, some members of Congress have an almost mythical resistance to raising revenue at a moment when Americans and big corporations have the lowest tax burden in more than half a century. And this line graph really looks at the reduction of tax revenue, and that's, of course, policy-driven. It's people-driven. Choices have reduced our tax revenue over this time. On December 31st, of course, our lawmakers did allow the tax breaks for the wealthiest 1% of Americans to sunset. They did so grudgingly, even though many of our nation's wealthiest folks were urging lawmakers to increase the pot of money to be spent. And as a result, we'll see approximately $620 billion in additional revenue over the next decade. And that's a lot of zeros, as we say at National Priorities Project. But there's much more available. Officially, for example, large U.S. corporations are slated to pay 35% tax on their profits, and in practice, they pay nothing like that. In 2012, for example, corporate givebacks, a combination of corporate givebacks, loopholes, and overseas tax havens cost the U.S. Treasury, and this is a conservative estimate, $165 billion. So that's just corporate tax loopholes and givebacks and offshore tax havens, and just for 1 year. That's a sizable amount of revenue that's being lost to this hard to pin down corporate tax code. Of course, the last and perhaps most biting is that sequestration, as I'm sure many of you know, it's upending our democracy. We deserve better than government by crisis, and through our taxes, our federal income taxes and our FICA taxes, we are the nation's major bill payers. and our federal income taxes and payroll taxes are joining together in these big pots that sit at the national level, and then they flow into state budgets, into city coffers, local businesses and programs, and to us when we need it. And so the cycle of us contributing and then making our priorities heard is broken by sequestration. So there are currently 2 continuing resolutions being considered. Neither of them, for the 13 budget, neither of them deal with sequestration. We have heard lawmakers on both sides of the aisle actually indicate that, in fact, sequestration is likely here to stay in the short to medium term. And of course, this is just the first year of sequestration. We took out $85 billion through sequestration in 2013, and in subsequent years, people think it'll be upwards of $110 billion. So it is something to really scan and keep on our radar and try to track. Those of us concerned with Pentagon spending, you know, there's been a lot of terrific conversation, and perhaps we can cover that more about the role of sequestration in this larger conversation about budget priorities. But mindful of time, we'll move on to the 13 budget. So we were supposed to have this budget, as this slide indicates, on October 1st. People expected to not have a 2013 federal budget due to an election year, so that can, as it will, was kicked down the road to March 27th, a deadline fast approaching. And there are 2 current proposals, and they would actually extend the continuing resolution through to September 30th. And there are a number of reasons that a lack of a meaningful budget debate and an extension of continuing resolutions at this time are concerning. The larger one, I think, tied to the conversation around sequestration, is that it doesn't allow for this, we would hope, impassioned, meaningful debate about the impacts of these rather indiscriminate across-the-board spending cuts. The other is that without a real blueprint for 13, we are not able to really have a debate about the policy priorities set forward before the nation last February in the Obama blueprint, and then the responses to those in other subsequent budget blueprints. We're not able to really chew on them. So right now we're simply just, it's as if we're doing 12 over the continuing resolution. And that both does not allow programs that President Obama thought should sunset to sunset, and it does not allow the infusion of capital to go forward into 13 for priorities that he really and his administration believe should happen. So it's concerning. The other thing to be concerned about, of course, is that Congress, even though there are some commonalities, we're not really close to getting some reconciliation on this continuing resolution. And so should we not do that, of course, March 28th would be a different day for the nation. Right? We're going to start to talk about that. And we should be, you know, in ourselves urging Congress to find a sound way through this. Because we'll start to hear the same thing that we heard during the last period where we were trying to avert government shutdown, you know, the ramifications of not being able to legislate a sound deal. So moving on, we have now no 2014 budget. So the White House is required by law to submit a budget, but one thing that we should all take note of is that the Office of Management and Budget actually said very clearly to the American people, hey folks, you know, we actually don't know what the impact of sequestration will be because it really is uncharted territory, and they were very clear about that. They were also clear about the fact that Congress wasn't able to deliver a 13 budget, and it's made creating the blueprint for 14 very, very difficult. And we're hearing now that it is scheduled for April 8th, although that is not an in-stone deadline. And in very unprecedented terms, there have been 3 so far budget proposals coming from Congress, one from Chairman Paul Ryan of the House, very much like his one from last year, one from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, also like theirs from last year, but going a bit further, and then for the first time in 4 years from the Senate, from Chairwoman Patty Murray. And so we did look, and we are looking at those side by side at National Priorities Project, and I'll offer a brief thumbnail for each of them. They are starkly different views about how the nation should move forward into the next decade. So here is a quick synopsis of the Ryan budget. So Paul Ryan makes some substantial cuts to social safety net programs, to food stamps, and to Medicaid. And that's to the tune of $5.7 trillion over a decade of cuts. He also believes that we should prevent Pentagon cuts, so he sort of backs out of sequestration, if you will, and continues war funding and maintains an annual war funding budget of about $37 billion over the next decade. He is going back to his blueprint of last year. He's looking at these two tax brackets, which would substantially reduce taxes on the top earners. So he's looking at this 10 and 25% bracket, and he's also looking at reducing corporate tax rates, so down from 35%. And then this a big thing to take note of is that he's positing to release profits from overseas operations, from U.S. taxation. And so he is talking about being able to, based on his own calculations and the baseline, being able to balance that budget by 2023. This is different in this year from last year. Last year it was out to 2040, but this year he actually achieves greater amounts of cuts, and we can talk more about that. I mean, it's cuts across a broad range of things, including things like Pell Grants and beyond. The Congressional Progressive Caucus budget, also in the House, and this is, of course, from Chairman Raul Grijalva and Keith Ellison. It does a lot on revenue. So the first slide here is on revenue. As you can see, it's tackling some corporate revenue loopholes. It is going after the top 2% of Americans, and also then on millionaires and billionaires, raising those taxes beyond their current levels. That would be the top 1% and the fraction of 1% of folks who are in that. As you'll remember, President Obama campaigned for letting the top 2% of Americans tax breaks sunset, so this goes back to that conversation. And it's looking at this Wall Street sales tax on financial transactions, and that's among its revenue propositions. It is, it does quite a lot of spending. It looks at $4.2 trillion over 10 years, focused on job creation and tax credits. It actually talks specifically about closing state budget gaps for 2 years as a way to ballast or create a ballast for state budgets, which it discusses as being, under siege. It actually is going at that prescription drug prices, and I imagine saving about $157 billion, again, over a decade. And you'll see here an increase of funding for SNAP, or that's the food stamp program's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It infuses funds into education budgets. It is looking for an expedited troop withdrawal. It is going after about $897 billion over 10 years from the baseline Pentagon budget, and it's looking at Cold War era weapons and also nuclear weapons as part of the solution to that. And it actually tries to take Obamacare forward and also shore up Medicaid funding. So those are the two House blueprints. And then Patty Murray's budget in the Senate, it also raises revenue, nearly $1 trillion. It is looking at about $100 billion in economic stimulus, and her budget talks about looking specifically at transportation infrastructure and worker training as areas of focus. It's looking at saving in healthcare reform, about $275 billion over 10 years, and this is more administrative. It's very much along the lines of what President Obama was talking about when he said that when we look to programs like Medicare and other kinds of health programs for cost savings, they should be in efficiencies and administrative costs and profit and not in the people. It also looks to an end of the Afghanistan war, and it is beginning to reduce Pentagon spending. And here we believe it's about $240 billion over 10 years. So that's the current national conversation around the budget. And again, we believe these three budget proposals will get floor votes. And we believe that President Obama's blueprint will be due out sometime in April, just as Congress is getting back from recess. So the fourth point of this current collision is, of course, the debt ceiling. So the debt ceiling, good way to think about it, is the limit Congress places on its own borrowing. And so we are in this moment where we have allowed the debt ceiling conversation to extend to May 18th. And so as we consider the 14 budget, we will be in its midst. Again, there's strong echoes for August of 2011. And I just wanted to close with a quote that from an email I got from a woman in Arizona. She emailed me out of the blue one day. She had been on National Priorities site, and this is all she wrote. This is madness. We should be out in the streets. And again, I just want to really applaud the work of Wand and Will in your efforts to galvanize people to make our voices heard in the midst of this critical time for the budget. A National Priorities Project is here to be with you. We have tools and resources, blogs, and of course you can find us on social media. We will be releasing this side-by-side. We have a game called Build a Better Budget, which we've factored in sequestration for, and that's available on the site, and you can build your better budget and send it right to Congress. And of course we did that with a number of national partners. And we'll be releasing, like many years, tax day. We'll have a calculator where you can actually run, or constituents can run, a tax receipt and then send that to their elected officials. And of course we'll infuse it in our organizing campaigns. And this is how to find me. I'm delighted to have more of a conversation with you now, but should you need anything from National Priorities Project, we work for you. We're delighted and feel really privileged to be in this community, and of course we crunch numbers, and that's our job, that's our part of this partnership, but our numbers are only good if they're put to use by stellar folks in the field. And so with that, perhaps we can go into questions and have a deeper conversation, tackle some new ground.
Thank you so much, Jo. That was a great presentation, a great explanation of all the chaos going on with the federal budget. I just want to remind everyone how to submit questions. In your attendee panel, there is a box labeled questions, and if you type those questions in, they will come to me, and I will read them aloud to Jo. And while everyone is thinking up their questions, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kathy Robinson, who is WAN's Senior Public Policy Director. Kathy?
Thank you, Ezzy, and thank you so much, Jo. That was a great presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure others did as well, and I'm sure that you have lots of questions because it's quite an interesting conversation, and the budget process is so different this year. And normally everything starts with the president's budget, and of course we're having a lot of this discussion, but we still don't have the president's budget. So I do think that it provides a unique opportunity, one that's actually been going on along with the whole roller coaster. All of the different fiscal clips have provided us with the opportunity to raise the issue about what our budget priorities really are. And Amy Jo outlined well that our federal budget really is a reflection of our values and our priorities, and it's not just a bunch of numbers. It's very much a moral document. And WAN's mission is really to empower women to work to shift excessive spending on the Pentagon to other human and environmental needs, because we think that would better reflect our values and our priorities for the United States of America. And we have had some unique opportunities to raise that issue, and we will continuing to go forward. Jo mentioned tax day coming up, and I think that also as we approach this next fiscal cliff, which is probably going to be the debt ceiling, that all through the spring there will be many opportunities to raise issues about the budget and to let your members of Congress know where you think they should be voting and how they should be voting and to better represent your priorities. I am hoping that there are plenty of questions for Jo now, and I want to turn it back over to let her respond to some of those questions. So thank you again so much, Jo. And
Pleasure.
Ezzy, you want to go ahead with the questions?
Sure. Thanks, Kathy. Our first question is from Rose Therese Nolta, and Rose asks, what are some concrete steps we can take so the poor and vulnerable are not burdened in the budget?
Oh, that's a really good question. Something to know, and we've only calculated this thus far for the Ryan budget, because this is all really happening real time. The 62%, roughly 62% of the $5.7 trillion in the cuts in the Ryan budget will fall on families and disproportionately fall on families currently low income. So I think Rose's question is very well timed. I think a clear message coming from advocates is that budgets are about two things. They're about how we're going to make our money and how we're going to spend it, and that there's our nation doesn't have to consider itself locked in this deficit reduction paradigm, that we really can look responsibly, meaningfully at deficit over time while still living in a nation that we can be proud of, and still allowing for a very nuanced, sophisticated conversation about tax policy that would mean that we would have more resources that we could allocate with greater levels of prioritization that match U.S. priorities at this time, and we could still do that in a frame of being good fiscal stewards, so that our kids and our kids' kids are going to live in a fiscally sound nation. So I think, just to recap, we're not broke. We can find a way forward to meet the needs of Americans and be good long-term fiscal stewards, and that it's imperative that we're able to achieve this balance.
Speaking of balancing, our next question is from Don Mathis, and Don asks, some pundits argue that regular folks have to balance their own family budgets, so why doesn't the federal government have to balance its budget? Please explain why that analogy does or doesn't hold up.
That's a really good question. The budget process, and especially at the federal level, it was meant to ebb and flow based on people's needs in the country from a very bird's eye, from a national level. So, Don is right that families bear a burden, if you will, of needing to get a ledger out and needing to really make sure that what's coming in matches or it doesn't fall short of what's to be spent. But the nation is different. A republic that takes care of its people and creates a common well-being needs to expand, needs to risk, and this budget is, so it allows Congress to borrow on behalf of spending and revenue priorities that it sees fit. So, our Congress is allowed to borrow, so we are allowed to borrow in the name of a fiscal blueprint that matches our nation's priorities, and that matches the sort of the aspirations and goals we have for our nation as a whole and for its people. It's not so much different than a student who gets a credit card and borrows books, borrows money for books, or a family that puts money together to buy a home. Both the student and the family owe money, and they have a reason for owing money, that is to get them into a place of greater security or better opportunity. So it's not so much different from a national perspective. And I think that part of the conversation, so the Rose conversation that we just had was, how are we going to protect people in that? And, my thought about that was budgets are about two things as much as they are about spending and revenue. Then this is the conversation about, a nation can expand to try to seize this opportunity. And that I think the question to be had in this conversation is then, how are we going to prioritize the spending of that expansion to really get us the kind of return on investment that the nation and its people deserve.
All right. Our next question is from Susan Cundiff. Susan says, Juan has always used the discretionary budget pie to talk about redirecting resources from the Pentagon to human needs. What visual images would you suggest using to talk about revenue as well?
Oh, great question. You know, NPP has an overall revenue pie that we use that's actually very, very striking, and I didn't include it in this presentation, but what it does is when we look at it from our income taxes and from our payroll taxes, it is a striking representation of how much the people of the United States are contributing to this federal fund, which is the big pot of money that pays for 2/3, and then these much smaller trust funds. And it is a striking, for me, a very striking reminder of the sort of the social covenant that we entered into in this nation, whereby the people are asked to pay the bills largely, not entirely, right? We've come through a period of fairly high borrowing, but of the mechanisms that are generating revenue, individuals are the real major bill payers. So for me, that's a very striking image and a reminder both about our right and our responsibility, right? So we have a right, because we are in the social covenant, to have a really meaningful engagement with lawmakers and imagine that they should pay attention to what people in local communities are saying. So that's one image for me that really, really works. The other thing I should say is that one of the things that we included in this side-by-side comparison of the Ryan, CPC, and Murray budgets is we took some recent poll data that really looks at what the American people are saying we want, and we're laying that side-by-side to these budget blueprints, and really just to sort of measure them up. Are these budget blueprints reflective of overall American values? Because as Kathy was saying, it is the Barbara Lee quote that we use so often, right? That the budget's a moral document, and that it's our nation's values and numbers.
All right, great. Our next question is from Robert Whitney, and Robert asks, what relationships have been formed with other groups that are addressing the same issues and agendas as National Priorities Project?
You mean who are NPP's partners?
Sure.
Okay. Well, and here's the opportunity of this moment. The kind of people engaged at the federal level, at the national level about the federal budget is growing every single day, and it has been for the last 2 years, as I'm sure many are aware, based on the nation really turning so much attention to this document that isn't any longer this dusty thing that sits on a shelf, or these tens of thousands of lines of data that don't have meaning in our lives. I think we've seen the meaning and of the federal budget and why we should be attending to it. So the network of folks at the national, state, regional, and local levels tackling this and thus using and working with NPP has grown. And I actually have to say that one of the things I'm most proud of is that it is really a broad cross-section of folks from across the country. So there aren't, there aren't an exclusive set of ideologies driving people to want to have a conversation about a meaningful way forward for our nation. So we participate in large working groups, among them the Budget Priorities Working Group, and certainly with national partners like Jobs with Justice, National People's Action, and then there's the SAVE Coalition, which is really championed so beautifully by the Coalition on Human Needs, and we're proud to be part of that. And then we work, again, across the political spectrum to some more politically neutral groups, and then groups really trying to find footing that would be perhaps considered along the conservative elements of the spectrum.
All right, our next question is from Ann Scholl, and Ann asks, what specific effects does sequestration have on state budgets?
Really good question. So if we go back here, I'm just actually going to flip back to this little graphic that we created. So if we imagine that sequestration is, of course, this $85 billion coming out of the discretionary pie between March 1st and September 30th, and then we imagine that the discretionary budget is the kind of money coming into state budgets and city governments and local businesses and local programs, the stuff we think of when we think of federal spending, things like, in terms of education, Title I, school breakfast and lunch, in terms of environmental protection, clean water, inspectors, national park rangers, in terms of infrastructure, money for roads and bridges, tunnels, in terms of things like airports, air traffic controllers. And then in terms of folks like you and me, this might be opportunities that we would get through job training and the like. It will have it's going to have a profound effect. I think one of the things that we struggle with is that, of course, because the budget's so huge, right? The blueprint for 2013 was $3.67 trillion. And so I think of it this way. So if one earned $1 million, it would take that person 1 million years to earn $1 trillion. So it's all that times 3.67. So it's quite a lot of money, and $85 billion in itself is a lot of money. So one of the challenges we have about talking about sequestration is that we won't see it happen overnight. It's going to have these incremental impacts. For example, at the Library of Congress, which is actually going to fare better than most government agencies or organizations, the workers at the Library of Congress are going to have to take 3 furlough days between March 1st and September 30th. So they'll have 3 days less pay. And these particular workers can do that in 4-hour increments, so as to spread the pain, if you will, across their paychecks and mitigate the risk to their families. But I would imagine that that would leave them 3 days with 3 days less money, and that might have an impact. For example, I talked with someone from the Library of Congress, and the staff person said that she and her family weren't going to go vacationing this year because we just don't know. And I thought that was really interesting, right? So we're going to start to see the primary results from budget cuts, and we're going to see the tertiary, the secondary results through slowed salary growth and or reductions in salary, which will then have an impact on the service sector. And remember, that's just year 1.
All right, next question is from Paul Garver. Paul says, although the Congressional Progressive Caucus budget seems the most rational and fair way forward, it seems unlikely to pass the Republican House. Do you think it will influence the White House to present a budget that moves in this sound direction if it receives support from most House Democrats?
You know, it's a good question, Paul. It's not clear to me what the White House strategy is going to be. I think you're quite right to imagine that the CPC budget is not going to prevail in the House. Although it will get a vote this year, it's quite likely that the Ryan budget will prevail like it did last year. It's not clear to me what the Obama administration is considering. We've been following here the Senate Budget Committee and some of the narrative that's emerging around the continuing resolution for 2013 that's been praising significantly compromised positions. So it's not clear. It's not clear. I wish I had a better answer for you. I actually don't. It's not clear what the CPC budget will, what impact it might have on the Obama administration, especially in light of the fact that right now in Congress there isn't the political will to have it make greater gains, and certainly not a corollary budget in the Senate that could come to some sort of reconciliation.
Well, our next question is from Patricia Paulson. Patricia asks, looking down the road, how can we meet the needs of our population without continued borrowing and expansion so we don't end up like Greece?
It's a really good question. One of the things to remember is that some pundits and some members of the media and some politicians have actually tried to characterize government spending as running away. That we've had this runaway government spending. In truth, during the economic crisis of some of 8, 9, 10, we did have an expansion in social safety program usage, and so we did see, for example, the greater need for food stamps, greater use of food stamps, greater eligibility for some of the social safety net programs. But on the whole, discretionary spending has actually been have achieved very, very modest growth over this last decade. So I think that's one thing just to keep in mind. In terms of reining in spending, oh my heavens, we need meaningful healthcare reform. We just need it. We know we need it. It is something that we should be taking so seriously as a nation because we must achieve some stability in that area. That is an area where we have seen some increased growth that is ultimately not sustainable. And then at the same time, again, mindful of being fiscally sound and not wanting to get ourselves into an overly precarious position around debt, overall aggregated debt, or these annual deficits. We should be looking at revenue, especially in this current position where we actually have a real low tax burden relative to history in this nation. And we should be thinking, are there things we can do to have a meaningful path forward where we can raise a little bit more money? If you remember that tax chart, we've seen a dip in corporate revenue, for example, and we could make a meaningful change to that tax policy to try to see that go in a different direction. We could look at things like payroll tax caps. So right now we currently pay tax on our payroll taxes up to $113,700. And that's an interesting idea, to not put a cap on it. So that means that anybody making $226,000 or $227,000 is going to pay payroll tax on about 50% of their income. So what would happen if we raised that cap or eliminated the cap? That would change the game, if you will, on revenue, like potential game changers in corporate revenue. So I think we should begin exploring those things as a mechanism to look at a sounder budget. So those are just a couple of ideas.
And here's a follow-up question. Do you think it seems feasible for constituents to lobby to have laws put in place to protect education and safety net programs against the sequester?
Certainly we could make a case for the unbridled impact of sequester in social safety net and education programs. I mean, I think I think the stronger position is that sequester is really just the worst form of governance, and that Congress really needs to legislate in a transparent, open, and accountable way to constituents. I think that's the stronger position. It is one where we're going to see ourselves being able to work with the diversity of opinions that may be on this call today, and then even, and beyond that, because we'll find a great deal of commonality with each other on that, and then with folks from across the country. And it's not like the sequester is hitting everything equally. So there is precedent for the sequester to exempt certain things. So you could go in that direction, but I do think that the strongest thing to say is sequestration is just bad governance. Let's take a look at this and find a way forward. That, where we do find a conversation about revenue, a conversation about shift of priorities, a conversation about being good fiscal stewards and finding these efficiencies and being willing to look them in the eye together, and a real conversation about what's best for the nation.
All right. Our next question is about finding waste in the budget. So are there any specific areas of the budget where you think we could make even deeper cuts than the sequester? Like perhaps Pentagon spending comes to mind. But any other sectors that you think we could make cuts to in order to protect safety net programs?
Well, I mean, we see some blueprints making some headway around healthcare and particularly Medicare costs. You know, looking at prescription drug prices, looking at administrative. President Obama talked a lot last year. It got lost in all the debate, but his blueprint really looked at administrative overhead and profit and really tried to tackle that in Medicare, and that was part of. He was called out again and again for cutting Medicare, but the conversation didn't move to how he was going to cut it. And I think we could look there in the sort of larger basket of healthcare reform. And you know, you mentioned the Pentagon. You know, there's bipartisan support, strong bipartisan support, not nominal, for looking at the fiscal stewardship of the Pentagon. And so, you know, many listeners may know of the Sustainable Defense Task Force. This is a bipartisan commission. My colleague Chris Hellman was part of it, but he was, you know, and he was joined by folks from both sides of the aisle, and they took a meaningful look at the overall Pentagon budget, and with a very large charge about, you know, asking, is it making us secure? Are we secure? And the Sustainable Defense Task Force made recommendations that really looked at the best way to spend taxpayer dollars. And it turns out, again, from this bipartisan viewpoint, that in fact some of the ways that we're spending money, and it found actually about $960 billion over a decade that could be cut. That's a lot of money, $960 billion over a decade. If we were to achieve things like a shift in force structure, meaning looking at our U.S.-based posture and thinking, is this the best thing for us? Looking at the way in which we're gearing up to fight wars. And what SUSDEF found was that, in fact, we spend a lot of money fighting wars or gearing up to fight wars that are, in fact, sort of the old way we used to fight wars, and we don't fight those wars this way. So let's actually look at what we're doing and how we're spending money. And so it turns out that planes, for example, like the F-35, are extraordinarily expensive, and they are, in fact, not what's needed. So it looked at a range of these issues and said, okay, you know, in fact, if we diverted some resources to different ways of tooling up our military, if we looked at conflict prevention, and of course it's joined in this by the Unified Security Budget, which is another great model of looking at security measures. If it's joined in this effort by conflict prevention, resolution, and some diplomacy measures, sort of soft security measures, that in fact we can actually achieve greater levels of security and at the same time reduce the overall burden the Pentagon lays on the overall discretionary budget.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. I know we have a few more questions here, but we are just about out of time. So, Joe, thank you so much for your presentation, for taking questions. I think that was a really, really helpful overview of what's going on at the national level with the budget. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for the webinar. We, of course, encourage you to stay in contact with Wand and Will and with the National Priorities Project. You can see the National Priorities Project website there. But please be sure to visit wand.org and willwand.org for information from Wand and Will about what's happening with the budget and with other national security issues. We'll be sending out follow-up materials with the information in this presentation, so be on the lookout for that in your email. And again, thank you so much for joining us.